Working in a hospital for over 20 years makes a person grow a thick skin. Anna had seen it all. Patients arriving in critical condition who didn't survive, families devastated by loss, bodies being wheeled into the morgue under white sheets. Death was part of her daily routine, and she never believed in ghost stories. But that night something changed. It was past 3 in the morning and the hospital was in absolute silence. Only the low hum of monitors and the occasional beep of equipment broke the peacefulness of her shift. Anna was walking down the basement corridor where the morgue was located, needing to retrieve some files from the adjacent room before returning to the ICU. Then she heard the voices. She stopped in the middle of the hallway, furrowing her brow. They were whispers, soft, incessant, like a collective murmur. They weren't coming from one specific spot. They seemed to spread through the air as though the very atmosphere were breathing words. Her stomach churned. The first thing she thought was that someone had left a radio on inside the morgue. Or maybe a doctor was in there talking with an assistant. But something was off. The voices were not normal. They spoke different languages, blending together in a dissonant chorus, like a senseless prayer. Some words sounded familiar, but others were guttural, scratchy, laden with something ancient and wrong. A chill crawled over Anna's neck. The sound was coming from inside the morgue. She hesitated. Any sensible nurse would turn around and pretend nothing happened. But for some reason, curiosity, instinct, or sheer recklessness, Anna walked toward the door. She placed her hand on the doorknob. The cold metal made her heart speed up. She pushed it slowly. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a dark, freezing room. Only the emergency light flickered weakly from the ceiling. The voices grew more intense. She felt the air change. The pressure in the room was different, as if it were heavier. The strong smell of formalin and alcohol felt thicker than usual. And then, the sound stopped, instantly. The silence was so absolute that Anna could hear her own heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The gurneys were covered with white sheets, and the steel cabinets reflected the intermittent glow of the emergency light. Anna felt her throat go dry. Maybe she was tired. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, she noticed something was wrong. The morgue drawers were all open, one by one. The dull thud of reality hit her like a weight. Those drawers had locks. They couldn't have opened on their own. Anna took a step back, her body going into alert mode. Instinct screamed for her to run, but her legs felt stuck to the floor. And that's when she heard it. One final whisper, right next to her ear. "You'll lie down too." Anna's breath caught in her throat. She pivoted on her heels and sprinted out of the morgue without looking back. She requested a transfer. The next day, she never fully explained what happened. When anyone asked, she simply said, "I'm never going back down there. Never again." And she kept that promise. But every now and then, when passing by the basement corridor, she still felt a shiver and had the impression she could hear distant whispers. Every morgue has its strange tales, but this one was different. Staff talked about it in hushed tones, exchanging wary looks, as if just mentioning it might reawaken something. It was a rainy night when the body arrived. An unidentified man found dead under a city overpass. No documents, no clue as to who he was or how he got there. Authorities labeled it as a natural death. Homeless, they said. Hypothermia, or overdose, they suggested. A case of no importance, a body with no name. He was logged into the morgue system. Room 3, drawer 14. That night's technician on duty, Marcos, did his job without question. He put on surgical gloves, set up the gurney, and moved the body into the cold chamber just like any other night. He noted that the man's skin was rigid, icy, with an almost translucent pallor, but none of that was unusual. What bothered him was the expression on the deceased man's face. Most bodies arrived with relaxed muscles, features slack in the stillness of death. But this one seemed alert. His mouth slightly open, his eyes half-lidded, as if on the verge of saying something. Marcos ignored his unease. He placed the body in drawer 14, locked the steel compartment, and went back to his desk. Everything seemed normal. The disappearance. The next morning, around 7 a.m., the forensic pathologist, Dr. Henrique, arrived to begin the autopsy. He checked the records. Room 3, drawer 14. But when he pulled the drawer's metal handle, it was empty. Henrique frowned. He looked at the number, checked the paperwork, called an assistant. "Where's the body from drawer 14? The assistant shrugged. "You didn't authorize the removal of any body overnight." Henrique felt a chill run down his spine. "There must have been a filing error," he said, trying to remain calm. They went through the files, scoured every corner of the morgue. No other body had been moved. The man had simply vanished. The camera footage. When the security team was brought in to review the footage, the mystery deepened. The recording showed the morgue as usual, until 3:12 a.m. At that moment, the footage cut out. 10 minutes of black screen. When the video came back at 3:33, drawer 14 was open. The body was gone. No movement in the morgue during that interval. No one entering or leaving. No staff rifling through files. No electrical failure in the rest of the hospital, simply blackout. And when the cameras returned, the body had disappeared. Unanswered questions. Hospital administration tried to sweep the case under the rug. No official report was made. No call to the police. Drawer 14 was assigned to another corpse the following night, but the employees knew. Marcos, the technician, who had placed the body in the cold chamber, quit a week later. He said he hadn't slept well since that night, that he woke up every morning at 3:12 a.m., drenched in sweat, feeling as if someone were watching him. Dr. Henrique stayed on at the hospital, but from then on, he refused to do autopsies after dark. And some say if you walk past the morgue in the early hours and really pay attention, you can hear a sound coming from drawer 14, a faint noise, something like breathing. The graveyard shift in the morgue was always peaceful and quiet. Night guard Roberto was used to his shift. He spent the hours watching the monitoring screens, drinking the watery coffee from the old vending machine, and occasionally patrolling the hospital's empty corridors. It wasn't a tough job, but there was something about the morgue that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the complete silence, broken only by the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, or the strong smell of formalin mingled with the metallic chill of the place. But that night, his restlessness went beyond the ordinary. At 3:23 a.m., the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the empty morgue, making Roberto jump. He frowned. No one ever called the morgue in the middle of the night. With a sigh, he picked up the phone and put it to his ear. "Security, who's speaking?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Then a raspy voice whispered, "Can I go home yet?" Roberto felt a shiver run down his spine. The voice was weak, like someone who struggled to speak. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone firmer than how he felt inside. Silence returned. Then a click. The call ended. Roberto pulled the phone from his ear and looked at the caller ID. His stomach lurched. The number was internal. It was the Morgue Zone extension. But he was alone down there. Movement on camera. A cold wave passed through him. He turned to the security monitors, which showed live feeds from around the hospital. One screen displayed the morgue. Everything looked normal. The gurneys draped in white sheets were lined up, motionless. No sign of movement. But then, a subtle rising of fabric caught his eye. Roberto's breath hitched in his throat. The sheet on the nearest gurney moved. It wasn't a sudden jerk. It wasn't the air conditioner or a draft. It was a faint up and down motion, as if someone underneath it was breathing. Roberto's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to get out of there and call for backup, but he knew no one would come until morning. With his eyes glued to the screen, he saw something even more terrifying. The sheet sank, as though an invisible arm was sliding out from under it. "This can't be," he whispered to himself. The phone rang again. This time, Roberto didn't answer. He just grabbed his radio and called the supervisor. When the man arrived half an hour later, Roberto didn't explain much. He just said, something wasn't right. The supervisor sneered, saying Roberto was probably tired. But when they checked the call logs, it was confirmed. Someone really had called from the morgue's extension. The morgue phone had supposedly never been used that night. The last call. The next morning, the deceased man's family arrived to collect his belongings. The man, Carlos Mendez, had drowned accidentally while fishing with friends. The body was found the day before and sent straight to the morgue. Everything seemed routine. The widow, a woman with graying hair and eyes hollowed by grief, received her husband's belongings. Among them, his phone, which was turned off. Before putting it in her purse, she reflexively checked the recent calls. Then her face went pale. This can't be right," she murmured. Roberto, watching from a distance, saw her hands tremble as she held the phone. She turned the device toward him. On the screen was one last call, recorded at 3:23 a.m. The number was her home phone. The air grew thick. The widow covered her mouth, trying not to sob. "This must be some kind of mistake, right?" she asked, her voice shaking. But no one could give her an answer. And that day, when Carlos Mendez's body was taken away, the morgue phone rang once more. This time no one picked up. Pedro never imagined he would end up working in a morgue. He'd always been skeptical about ghosts and apparitions, and the thought of dealing with corpses didn't bother him as much as he'd expected. The job was mechanical, logging bodies, storing them, making sure everything was ready for the autopsy team in the morning. The cold, silent environment was strange at first, but he was starting to get used to it. Until that night. The arrival of the body. It was 1:47 a.m. when the phone rang. A call from the hospital reception. A new body for the morgue. Pedro sighed and noted the details. Female, 82, died at home, natural causes. When he brought in the body, he saw that the elderly woman looked peaceful. Pale face, white hair, neatly combed. Unlike other bodies that arrived twisted by pain or trauma, this one looked simply asleep. Pedro checked the paperwork, logged the entry, and got ready to place her in the cold chamber. That's when he hesitated. He felt a slight discomfort, like he was being watched. The movement. He shook off the odd feeling and wheeled the gurney toward the cold chamber. Before closing the compartment, he cast one last glance at the body and froze in place. The old woman was sitting on the gurney, her body bent slightly forward, her hands on her knees, her head lowered. Pedro felt the blood drain from his face. Shock made him jerk backward instinctively. His heart began hammering in his chest. He blinked, unable to believe what he was seeing. And then, she was lying down again. The air felt thick. Pedro could hear his own ragged breathing echo in the silent morgue. I must have seen it wrong. I need more sleep. But a terrible doubt gnawed at his mind. Did she really move? He stood there for a few seconds, eyes glued to the body, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing. The old woman lay still, exactly as she should be. With trembling hands, he finally closed the drawer. But the unease didn't go away. Pedro felt as though something was watching him. That if he turned around fast enough, he'd see the old woman sitting up again. The confirmation. The next morning, Pedro arrived early to hand over the records to his supervisor. He tried to ignore what had happened the night before, convincing himself it was all in his head. But as he sipped coffee in the small staff room, one of the security guards struck up a conversation. "Hey man, survived the night?" Pedro forced a smile. "As always." The guard took a sip of coffee and gave him a strange look. "You saw it too?" Pedro frowned. "Saw what?" The guard let out a nervous laugh. "The old lady, sitting on the gurney, looking at you." Pedro froze. He nearly dropped his coffee. How do you know that?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The guard shrugged. "Man, the security cams catch some weird stuff in there. We see some things it's better not to mention." Pedro was speechless. He hadn't imagined it. That same day he quit, and he never set foot in that morgue again. Working in a morgue for over a decade toughens anyone up. Ricardo had seen all sorts of corpses, burned, mutilated, swollen from water or rotting under the sun for days before being found. He got used to dealing with the stench of death, the vacant stares of the deceased, and the absolute silence of the morgue at night. But nothing prepared him for the nameless man, the one who, to this day, still makes him wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. The body's arrival. The body arrived shortly after midnight. The hospital was already immersed in its usual nighttime stillness. A janitor mopped the corridor absent-mindedly. The security monitors showed deserted hallways, and the reception. Phone rang sporadically. Ricardo received the corpse as always. He checked the deceased man's file and signed the log. John Doe, no identification. He had been found dead on a downtown sidewalk. Likely cause of death, cardiac arrest. No sign of violence. No clue as to his identity. It seemed like another routine case. But something bothered Ricardo. Something was off about that body. The man's skin had a strange pale tone, almost grayish. The facial features were tense, as though still bearing traces of pain or some final expression before death. And, most unsettling, his eyes were slightly open. The procedure. Ricardo called his assistant, Bruno, and they began the embalming process. It was mechanical, making an incision to drain fluids, replacing the blood with a chemical preservative, and prepping the corpse for storage or a funeral. They had done this hundreds of times, but as soon as they made the first incision, the lights flickered 3 times. Ricardo and Bruno exchanged glances. The morgue's generator was old, and fluctuations happened sometimes. Nothing unusual. Ricardo picked up the scalpel and made the first cut into the corpse's abdominal cavity. And at that moment they heard a moan, soft, hoarse, as if the man had just woken from death. Growing fear, Ricardo froze. His heart leapt into his throat. Bruno stepped back, eyes wide. That was just air escaping the lungs, he tried to say, but his voice failed halfway through the sentence. Ricardo wanted to believe that, but he'd never heard such a human-like sound from a dead body. He took a deep breath and tried to carry on. But then came a second sound. This time it sounded like a long inhale, like the dead man was breathing in for the first time in a long while. Bruno dropped his instruments onto the steel tray with a loud clatter. "Dude, this isn't normal." Ricardo was about to say something to try to keep the situation under control when he noticed the scariest detail of all. The corpse's neck was moving, slowly, in an unnatural way. The head tilted to one side as if the dead man was turning to look at them. Ricardo felt such an intense chill that his entire body seemed to freeze. Bruno was already white as a sheet. "Ricardo, we're stopping now. Right now." But Ricardo couldn't speak, because at that moment he was certain the man did not want to be embalmed. The next morning, Ricardo arrived early to talk to his supervisor. But before he could say anything, the man raised a hand to stop him. "I already know." Ricardo frowned. "Know what?" The supervisor looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "The security cameras caught something, but word from the top is that the footage was erased." "What? What did they show?" The supervisor hesitated. "The body, it was moving." Ricardo felt a knot in his gut. "You saw it?" The supervisor nodded, not wanting to give more details. "Just forget it, Ricardo. Do your job and don't talk about it to anyone." But Ricardo never forgot. And even now, when he's alone in the morgue and the silence is far too deep, he feels like someone's watching him. He never embalmed another body without checking the deceased's face, twice. And he never again found another dead man who looked so alive.